Fantastic. And then I'm going to kick it off to Kim Meyer, Associate Vice President for Research and Development, to kick off our webinar.
Thanks, Christina. So good afternoon, everyone, and I'll echo Christina's thanks. We're glad that you could all make the time to join us today for this workshop. We're very excited to be bringing this to you. This is the first time that we're presenting these three webinars together as a workshop for our faculty and staff who are in the process or anticipate putting together a large and complex grant proposal in the not too distant future. If you could advance the slide for me. So what we want to accomplish today with this workshop is really help our faculty who are hearing from a variety of our leadership and through other channels, including our Strategic Research Infrastructure Initiative here at UVA, that we have an increased focus on getting additional large and complex awards here at the university. And so in order to get those awards, we have to submit competitive proposals. And that's really the point of today's workshop. So in addition to the workshop that's happening today, I wanted to make sure that you're aware of other resources that are available to you at the university, and my team is one of those resources. We are the Office for Research Development. We are within the VPR's office, and I'm going to give a few names and roles within the team, and then also refer you to our website, which we will put that link into the chat for you as well. So I'm the Associate Vice President for Research Development, and working with me are our two research development specialists, Maureen Olmsted and Sherry Gabbert. They are both here in the audience today as well. And then we have our limited submissions coordinator, Matt Dooley, and our research intelligence analyst, Matt Daring, who are also on the team. So we're a small but very vibrant team, and please reach out to us if you are working on one of these large and complex proposals. We can help you find the resources that you need. Today's workshop is really geared to help our faculty move from doing single investigator proposals towards that idea of team science and figuring out what you need to do collaboratively to put together one of these proposals in a competitive way. So Christina's going to walk us in more detail through the agenda and then lead us through each of these three webinars. And we will have Q&A at the end. And again, Christina's going to give us some more details on that. We offered consultations with the Office for Research Development team. In advance of this workshop, we offered them to directly follow this workshop. I know that that timing didn't necessarily work for everyone. And so if you are planning to submit a large and complex proposal in the very near future, please reach out directly to me. That's my email, and request a consultation with my team. We'll do a quick 20-minute consultation to find out a little bit more about your project and what you're planning to do, and start hashing out a plan for supporting your efforts there. The last thing that I'll mention is that we are recording today. As you heard Christina say, we are recording today's sessions. We're going to record each of the webinars individually. And so we will be able to provide those to attendees after the workshop, as well as slides from the workshops. And we have additional webinars under development, and we will keep you posted on those that will follow this, and we'll continue this momentum that we're building around large and complex proposals in the future. So with that, I will turn it back to Christina Weaver, who's going to lead us through all of this from Hanover Research today. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you so much, Kim. I just want to say it's been a real pleasure to work with Kim and her team working on this workshop. Such tremendous attention to detail, and having worked with clients all across the country in higher ed, you all really have a fantastic resource in her office. So I hope you will follow up with those consultations. A little bit about me. I work for a company called Hanover Research as a managing grants consultant. I am actually just down the road in Richmond, but spent about 14 years in Charlottesville, just a recent Richmond transplant. And I was especially excited to be part of this workshop because part of my time in Charlottesville featured a career at UVA. So these days I head up a team that works primarily on National Science Foundation proposals, working with faculty, both the single investigator, multi-investigator, and the sort of larger team science proposals. But my background as a grant writer really is pretty versatile. So I've worked across many different agencies and foundations, from the very local, including the local foundation in Charlottesville, all the way up to places like the Kellogg Foundation. But at UVA, I had this other career as an environmental and public policy mediator. I worked in a unit called the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation. That's part of the School of Architecture at UVA, and really is a national leader in sort of equitable collaboration, consensus building, and community engagement. And so I have a real passion for the kinds of grant proposals that really draw on that sophisticated collaboration skill set. And it's a real treat to be able to kind of think through some of the best practices, tips, tricks, and sort of conceptual frameworks that assist a grant writer in becoming a collaborator in that world of grants. It's rewarding to do that, and especially rewarding to be thinking through those things for an audience at UVA. So we are heading towards three kind of short-ish presentations. The first one will be a little bit longer, and the second two a little bit briefer. We'll have a break in there, about a 10-minute break. Of course, feel free to take the body breaks that you need to as we go. But all of these three presentations are aimed at looking at this topic of how do you work on larger, more complex grant proposals successfully, and really thinking about it as a continuum. As Kim said, everything from moving to that multi-investigator proposal, if you've been accustomed to sort of single investigator, all the way to these really, really, really large and complex grants that are sort of multi-million dollars and require a lot of cross-sector collaboration. So we're going to be providing kind of an overview and an orientation to the mentality that you really need to be succeeding on this collaboration continuum. In the first webinar, we'll be looking at kind of key planning considerations for that transition from single to multi-PI, what you need to think through to know that you're ready to do that, and some of the considerations when you're doing kind of the pre-thinking ahead of working on the proposal, as well as the proposal production process when you are working with multiple investigators. Then in our second webinar, we're going to kind of take a step back from the proposal production process and think about collaboration a little more pointedly. We're going to introduce that conceptual framework of the collaboration continuum when you're thinking about this kind of grant seeking. And what are the qualities and kind of best practices that make for strong collaboration? And then in the third webinar, we're going to be kind of circling back to this question of proposal production, but really thinking more about these very large and complex proposals where collaboration isn't just a nice to have, but it's really a must have at every stage of the process, from the initial sort of vetting of the opportunity all the way through, of course, to implementing and evaluating and continuing the work itself. We've designed this workshop to be sort of didactic in the beginning, meaning I'm going to be mainly talking at you through these brief presentations, and then to have what I hope will be a real conversation in the Q&A segment at the end. I want to really acknowledge the expertise and experience in the room. I had an opportunity to take a look at the folks who had registered to participate in this, and it's just a tremendous range of disciplinary expertise, a tremendous range of interest in this kind of grant seeking, with some folks who really know what they want to go after and others who just want to learn more. So we've tried to tailor this workshop for various experience levels, really hoping that in that Q&A segment, you all will also be contributing what you know, what your expertise, your tips and tricks as much as you can. Because we're saving up to about 30 minutes for Q&A at the end, I'll be noting questions and comments as they hit the chat, but we're probably going to be kind of saving those for later. But please feel free, as questions occur to you, to go ahead and use the chat to share those, or to jot them down and bring them back during the Q&A segment. Okay. So with all of that said, I want to move us into our first presentation, which is around this shift from transitioning from the single to the multi-investigator proposal. It's sort of that first shift on what we are calling the collaboration continuum. This is a relatively brief presentation, so you could go into great detail in any one of these sort of agenda topics, but we'll be hitting some highlights around how you really lay the groundwork for grant production efforts where you are the lead investigator on a multi-investigator proposal. So we'll be considering how you can set yourself up for success and how you can set your collaborators up for success, what your role is as the lead investigator, and what are the resources that you can turn to get support, such as accessing Kim's team to help navigate you to those resources, and then offering some tips for the proposal development itself. Again, please bring your expertise and your experiences to the Q&A. Grant seeking is sometimes more an art than a science, and everybody has good advice, everybody who has gone through this kind of work. So why is collaboration becoming such an important trend in grant seeking? It really has become a hot topic in grants. It really is an emerging or even emergent trend. And part of that is because it's increasingly viewed by sponsors, by funders, as a way that they believe they can amplify the impact of the dollars they are investing. So I always tell people who are getting started in grants, especially, that it's helpful to bear in mind as you're shifting your idea from sort of a worthy idea, a project that you know needs to happen in the world, to a fundable idea. You have to think about the fact that the funder is investing towards its return on investment. So they're really looking for what is this grant going to generate in terms of our priorities. And if you're talking about public agencies, federal agencies, part of the ROI is really around the kinds of broader impacts that advance more than new knowledge, that actually advance social or economic impacts. And we know that collaboration is key to driving synergies around those impacts. So as we talk about collaboration generally today, it's helpful to bear in mind that funders are really interested in this because society is at a point where the problems are really multifactorial and they can't be solved without multifactorial collaboration and solutions. Multi-investigator projects leverage diverse skills and experiences to allow for problem solving that just can't be done by one person. And collaborative research is often more innovative, it can have a larger impact, and this is something that funders are aware of, and they're increasingly investing in these more complex solutions. I think it's also interesting to note that for good reason, funders, like many institutions, are becoming much more serious about equity and about seeing evidence of equity that you can really only demonstrate through a collaborative approach. They want to see project teams, partnerships, and track records that really reflect an authentic commitment to equity. And that is an important consideration in collaboration. So we know that collaboration can drive important benefits in terms of enhancing the impact of your work, and as a result, increasing its competitiveness in the eyes of funders. But at the same time that it does all this great stuff, collaboration also adds many layers of complexity that you need to be prepared to manage if you are shifting into this kind of grant seeking. So it is important to ask yourself a series of assessment questions that are really aimed at reality testing. First of all, the extent to which your project truly requires multiple investigators, requires a more collaborative approach, and then whether you are ready and whether your institution can really support the work. And if the answers are positive to all of those questions, then there are important questions around really how will you do it? How will you foster effective collaboration? So we have an adage in the grant writing world that one should never just chase the funding. So it's always important to take the time to think through whether your research design, the work that you are wanting to contribute to new knowledge or to broader social impacts, whether that really does line up with the priorities of the funder that you are eyeing. And so, even though we know that a certain funder or a certain funding mechanism might be really privileging or even requiring a highly collaborative approach, you want to make sure that that's genuinely what you want to do. And so it is important, and always encourage people to do some thinking about the research design or the project design, even before you are considering a particular funding mechanism, to make sure that it also meets your goals. If you feel confident that your project requires a more collaborative approach and it's ready for that, then you have to ask yourself, are you ready? Are you ready to lead that effort as the lead investigator? And this slide just sort of presents some of the key considerations that might indicate that, yes, you are ready, or maybe you might want to shore up your own personal experience or track record in one of these areas. So to be ready to lead a multi-investigator project, you want to have a solid track record of your own in terms of securing funding and implementing successful research, where you are the single PI. And you probably also want to have served as co-investigator on other complex proposals where you got to not only participate in that kind of research, but also see how that lead investigator stewarded the proposal process and stewarded the research collaboration. Ideally, if you are assembling a team of investigators, you will have some prior positive experience of working with at least some of them. And you will have established some trust in yourself as someone who can lead and facilitate this kind of effort. So if you feel confident that you have most of those bullets down, then you likely are ready to move into that multi-investigator space. But if you are less sure, it's good to take some time to shore up your experience. Some of the other things to consider before getting started: can you develop an effective plan for leadership? Do you have the project management skills, or can you get support to kind of think through what it will take to lead not just the proposal production effort, but the actual research effort? And as part of that, also understanding that there are going to be rocks in the road. So any research effort really, but especially if it's multi-investigator and more complex, is going to have challenges. There are going to be barriers. There are even going to be interpersonal conflicts, kind of normalizing that is part of the process and doing some pre-thinking and anticipating about how are you going to handle things like that in both the proposal process and especially in the research implementation phase. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next webinar. Then you also need to be thinking through the landscape at your institution, and if you are pulling in co-investigators from other institutions, what are the policies, positive or negative, that might impact collaboration? Are you able to address those proactively? Who might you need to enlist to advocate for help with that? And then also thinking kind of early on, how are you going to assess and evaluate the success of your collaboration? So there's lots of questions that you'll see from these slides. They're not even necessarily about the science or the research, but they're also about the collaboration itself. To the extent that you think through these things early on, you'll just have a more successful experience and a more competitive proposal. Okay, as lead investigator, you are really the champion and the facilitator of the project. And because you are collaborating in a team of peers who all bring high levels of expertise and important perspectives, your job is really to create an environment of horizontal collaboration where there is still a leader. So like many roles in academia, there's a high degree of collegiality and respect that's necessary, but a little bit different from other kinds of collaborations in academia. There's also some very external parameters around sort of timeliness of things and urgency of things that you're going to have to take some responsibility for stewarding. So what that means is taking on the role of communicating with the funder, with the program officers or sponsor program managers, if you're able to, doing as much pre-thinking about the solicitation or the request for proposals, RFP, and really making sure that it's a good fit, doing a lot of that legwork for your team. And then gathering input from your collaborators and any other stakeholders, but taking some leadership and sort of synthesizing that input into a vision and sort of a strategic framework around which the proposal and the project can be latticed. You'll also have some responsibility for formalizing partner involvement, whether that's internal or external partners, and getting some of the MOUs or letters of support that you might need. So there's many hats that you wear if you are lead investigator on a multi-investigator project. Another hat that you wear is around setting the tone for the collaboration as a whole through the proposal process into the project by being very organized. So a lot of what you're going to be doing is planning. And this is why we say that when you move into more complex proposals, you need to build in even more time than you already know to build in for your federal grant seeking as a single PI. So you want to have a plan for preparing the proposal. This looks like thinking through divvying up, writing different sections, editing, reviewing different sections, developing a realistic timeline and plan, a sense of who's accountable for different components of what becomes an application package, and establishing a process of how you will share and retain drafts and other documents, and assigning clear responsibilities, communicating regularly. Most of the time, the lead PI is not the only author of the grant, so that's the good news, but you are the person who is kind of ultimately responsible for producing a grant that has a coherent voice, that is accurate, that is technically compliant, and that reflects the enthusiasm and the buy-in and the expertise of the other investigators who are part of the process. So you are really a project manager as well as a sort of an editor and steward of the entire process. Embracing your role in the proposal process begins with thoroughly digesting the funder solicitation. So highly encourage people to really take their time on the front end of the proposal development process. By doing that, by really taking your time there to do the planning, you are going to save so much time down the line as you assemble and motivate your proposal production team. When you are working with other people and it's not just you as a single investigator, it becomes more and more difficult to allow things like procrastination. It just doesn't work because you need to build in time for input, for rounds of review. And so becoming more methodical and systematic about laying the groundwork early is so important. Reviewing the RFP is also an important moment to just double check and reality test. Do you definitely have what it takes to pull this off? Is this definitely aligned with what you want to do? When you're reviewing the RFP, you want to think about eligibility, competitive criteria. You want to, many times federal agencies are very similar in what they request, but you have to decode kind of different language. So for example, for NSF, you talk about the principal investigator and the co-principal investigator. For other agencies, it might be the lead PI and the co-investigator. There's different language, and taking your time to kind of digest what this agency, how it works, what is its culture, the goals and expectations, and then of course, what are all the required components of the application package, and what are the required components of the narrative as sort of the cornerstone of that application package, and what is going to be your plan for stewarding the proposal process towards having a competitive package at the end. Once you've thoroughly digested the RFP, again, this is a good moment to take a step back and do a little bit more reality testing. Do you truly have the time? Do you truly have the time, information, insight, and support that you're going to need to create a competitive proposal that has a good shot at providing funding for the research you want to do? Often the answer will be yes, and you'll move forward from here. But sometimes the answer is going to be no, not yet. It would be better if we waited until the next cycle, if it's a funding mechanism that comes up every year, for example, or maybe I could only do this if we get some additional project management support or something like that. So just know that if you decide not yet, that is part of the grant seeking process. Grant seeking is very cyclical. It's all a learning experience. Sometimes people do go after a grant even when they're not prepared. thinking that, well, we'll get it reviewed and we'll be able to incorporate insights on the next round. If that is a strategy that you decide to embrace, just know that it's not always viewed positively by every sponsor. So it's something to look at and get some advice from Kim's team or folks like that about whether that's a good strategy. But know that it's okay to say not yet. I need to really shore up my capacity to pursue this level of complexity, and I'll do it in a year. That's a reasonable decision. Remember that it can take many months to pull together a complex federal grant proposal. And the more collaboration that's involved, the longer timeline you need to build in. A good rule of thumb for whether you have built in enough time overall is whether you actually have time to tackle one of the most important best practices in grant seeking, and that is to communicate with the sponsor. So probably the top piece of advice that I give to PIs that I work with is to reach out early and often to program officers. Most federal agencies encourage this, and it's even very much part of the program manager or program officer's role to be accessible to you. Many foundations as well. There are exceptions, so you always want to check with that. But it's truly a best practice if it's allowed to communicate with the sponsor. And you want to do this early and then in an ongoing way at key points. So the early is when you are really refining your research design and you have enough figured out to have a 1 or 2 page concept paper. You produce that concept paper to sort of resemble the genre of the agency. So for example, National Science Foundation, I always encourage people to do a 1-page project summary because that is in the end part of the proposal package as well. But you synthesize your ideas succinctly, and you reach out and ask for a conversation and ask for sort of feedback around whether your ideas are strategic and in alignment with the priority of this funding mechanism. And then it gives you the opportunity, ideally, to incorporate sponsor feedback into everything else that follows. In addition to this step, you also, of course, want to be sure to participate in any webinars that the funder puts out associated with this opportunity, and to ask any technical questions around sort of decoding the solicitation early so that you can have clarity as you work on the proposal. If you have built in plenty of time to communicate with the funder and do all the planning needed, then hopefully you do have enough time to produce a competitive proposal. Okay, so let's say you've digested the RFP, the solicitation, you've reality tested against your own ideas of what you want to do, and you believe that you have what it takes to move forward. And you've sort of confirmed with the funder, with the sponsor, that you have a compelling idea for that opportunity. At this point, you really need to think through the specific collaborators that you'll need to pull the proposal and ultimately the project together. And this is going to include the other investigators on your project, your academic colleagues, but it's also going to include key administrative support from your institution. And as Kim was inviting, kind of getting to know that landscape early and meeting the key people who are going to be able to support you even before you're doing this work is such a good idea. Every person on your kind of larger team, to include the administrative support, is going to benefit from early and frequent outreach from you in order to have the time for them to provide you with the support that you'll need to be competitive. When you're thinking about institutional approval and support, this might be your dean, chair of your department, central administration, or others, and they might be identifying and providing access to internal funding, which could be very useful for things like pilot or preliminary research, or for things like matching resources if that's required by the funding opportunity. They might also point you toward personnel, resources, equipment, and assist you with connecting to external partners and stakeholders as well as internal. For research development assistance, this might be at the school level or central research development specialists such as Kim's team. And these folks can help you with proposal plan management. So all these skills that I'm discussing in this presentation, they can help you to be prepared and to sort of steward that process, give you advice about how to decode that solicitation, advice about that funder, insight into what would be competitive for that mechanism, and also can help to kind of pull out what we call the style guide for the proposal. So this includes things like your technical compliance, your fonts and your margins, how things should be outlined. Also things like some of the keywords and the competitive criteria that are really important to kind of hit the mark for that funder. And they might help you also to navigate to other university resources that might be helpful, and even to do things like assist with data visualization, such as helping you pull together figures or tables that might be needed as part of your proposal. And then for the research and grant administration assistance, this might be at the school or central financial and pre-award specialists level. And this has to do with sort of compliance issues that queue you up to, if awarded, be able to really properly steward the award. So things like compliance reviews, is it technically compliant? Looking at the budget, making sure it's compliant both with UVA and with the sponsor, and then doing some of those final checks for approvals and actually loading the proposal in whatever system is being used for submission, and then assisting you with the actual submission at the end of the day. So all of this is complex and takes time and takes relationships, really, building relationships with the people who can assist you. And just again, to remember that it is okay to have assessed all of these aspects and to decide that you want to wait and go after that opportunity the next time around. That is perfectly reasonable thing to do. And sometimes you can arrive at that wise decision more effectively by really doing this legwork. I've definitely been part of projects where, in preparing a really clear digest, not just for myself, but for the collaborators on the project, and really giving them a realistic sense of what it was going to take to pull it together. Folks have been like, this is fantastic and I've learned a lot, but it will be better to wait until we have a little more capacity. And then on the other hand, if you do that due diligence and you get the green light, then you know that people are really bought in and it's sort of full steam ahead and people will really work together well to make it happen. So assuming you have laid the groundwork and assuming you have arrived at a kind of green light that you want to proceed, it's now time to really focus on developing the proposal. And remember that the proposal itself is also a collaborative effort. So just like the collaborative research that you are proposing in a multi-investigator context, you are going to be collaborating at a pretty rapid pace in the proposal production process. And this is where your team management and your project management skills will be hugely beneficial. So if you feel strong in that skill set, fantastic. If you feel like you could use support in developing that skill set, that's where Kim's team and others can be very helpful in helping you accomplish that. Remember that you are actually in the business of facilitating collaboration and tracking progress towards the goal of a competitive submission that reflects all of the strengths of the many experts that you have assembled to work with you. A project management plan, both for your research that you'll be sort of showcasing as part of the proposal, and a project management plan for the proposal production. They are very, very helpful tools in this process. In a multi-investigator context, the sponsor wants to see evidence of strong planning. So it's not enough that you have a great idea. It's not enough that you have the right expertise. You also have to show that your idea is feasible, that you will be able to pull it off within the timeline and given the resources available. And you do that by showing evidence that you have thought through your project management plan. And as I mentioned, that plan, you'll also have a plan for the proposal production process. So you'll want to think through all the items on this slide, everything from your visioning, your goals, your objectives, expectations, to what are the different roles that each investigator is going to play, thinking about not just the roles in terms of your science or your social science, but also roles in terms of things like assessment, evaluation, mentoring students, stewarding community partnerships. Those kinds of roles are very important too. You'll want to be thinking about data sharing, communication, what institutional infrastructure will be used for that. It will be more complex if your partnerships are across institutions. And then you want to be creating an environment that really fosters effective interpersonal dynamics. And you are starting that at the proposal production process. So thinking about things like, how often are we going to meet? What is the tone of our meetings going to look like? How are we delegating? How are we accountable to one another? These are all things that you can think through very systematically, even before you get started. And you want to ideally normalize a culture of asking for feedback, assessing how it's going, not just the project that you're implementing, but also the quality of the collaboration as well. Oh, excuse me. There we go. Sorry about that. One point I wanted to make is just, you're going to be potentially working with these folks for a long time, right? If you get funded. So making sure that you are setting up a process and a way of working together that you are also going to enjoy for the next 1, 2, 3 years, or even further into the future. Okay, so we are going to begin to wind down this first presentation with just some reminders about the key components of grant proposals that are pretty consistent across various sponsors and funding mechanisms, and thinking about these in terms of the multi-investigator kind of stage of collaboration. So as lead investigator, one of your most challenging tasks, which is the case as well when you're a single investigator, but folks often find crafting of the budget to be one of the most challenging pieces of the proposal. Excuse me. And if you are relatively new to more complex grant seeking, just know that you will need more time. Build in extra time to develop a more complex budget, to think through things like subawards, or how do you handle consultants if you're working with folks from other institutions. These things can take a little more time, especially when you're on a learning curve. And also not to save the budgeting for late in the process. You really want to work on the budget as early as you're working on the sort of project or research design, because the budget is a very important reality tester. One of the mistakes that people make in grant writing is not aligning their budget with their narrative. You want to make sure that those two pieces very much do line up and echo each other, and the budget will help you know for sure that you're able to accomplish what you're proposing in the narrative. You also want to do it early, because it often is the piece that takes a little more time in that internal administrative review process prior to submission. Of course, the other major component of any grant application is the core narrative. And in a collaborative grant writing process, you'll be playing a slightly different role than maybe you've played if to date you've mostly worked on proposals where you really are the only author, and then maybe you're getting feedback if you have time. This is going to be a more collaborative writing process. You may still be the one who's taking ownership of the final document. You may be synthesizing sections, but you may also have the opportunity to delegate to people according to their interests and their skills. You may have an investigator who really has a great grasp on the literature review. You may have an investigator who really already has expertise around sort of project management and can create that part of the plan, or who has expertise around evaluation. But you still need to build in time to kind of make sure everything is in a coherent voice and everything is compliant with the funder's requirements. So part of that building in time is having a strategy for how you're going to write and how you're going to review. Increasingly, people do like to write using things like SharePoint or Google Docs because it allows for a collaborative editing style. But just to flag that it can also create some confusion, especially when you get towards more final drafts. And I personally really like to shift things from collaborative writing to a linear, what I call linear review process for the editing, where, as lead PI, maybe you take all the collaborative work that's been done, you create a coherent draft that is sort of complete in all the sections. And then there's a series of people it gets passed to be refined and improved before coming back to you for near finalization and then moving into the compliance review. So that is the kind of process that can be very effective. But again, it takes time. So making sure that you are building in time from the beginning for a thoughtful and successful review process and for that final compliance check process. And then the third kind of major bucket of pulling the proposal together, we have the budget, we have the narrative, and then we have sort of management and personnel considerations that will be more complex for the multi-investigator project compared to the single investigator. So the complexity of your management plan and your personnel, your project team, is going to be reflected in several places. It will be reflected in the budget. It will be reflected in the narrative. But you'll also likely be pulling bio sketches from the various investigators, potentially also commitment letters, and potentially additional sort of ancillary documents that really highlight the nature of the collaboration itself. So building in some time and some thoughtfulness for that part of the proposal as well. Okay, and here we have just a general checklist that recaps sort of the key areas of consideration that we've covered in this first presentation in our workshop. These are the kinds of areas you want to be covering when you're doing that, laying the groundwork and you're preparing for a successful proposal development process. So thinking through, can you get institutional approval for this? And how do you go about that? How much time is that likely to take? Are there going to be issues with investigators from other institutions also needing to get any kind of sign off? Assembling a team of people who are aligned and engaged and who want to work together ideally, and if funded, will be excited to do the work together for the next however many years. Taking your time to really digest the RFP and the sponsor expectations, ideally kind of confirming your understanding of that by communicating with the sponsor, and then making sure that you have a well-developed approach to the project that you want to seek funding for and for the proposal development process, that you have a plan to address administrative and management decisions, using the budget as a reality tester. Am I actually going to have the resources to achieve the goals that I've articulated? Do I need to adjust the goals, or do I need to adjust the allocation of the budget? And then moving into the nitty-gritty of writing up, which itself has a very strong plan, is its own kind of mini project management enterprise, especially when you are working with multiple authors, multiple collaborators. And of course, not forgetting that you need to have a plan for submission. And ideally, of course, we always recommend that people aim to submit early in advance of the sponsor deadline. So it's a lot to keep track of, it's a lot to plan for, and it's a lot to execute. So these are some of the tools and strategies that can help you and that you want to be thinking about early as well. So getting letters of support, and getting assistance with what I call the sort of ancillary documents of the application, asking for help early so that people aren't blindsided by your procrastination or your urgency late in the game. Also getting bio sketches, getting memorandums of understanding or letters of support or commitment, having that digest that you create for yourself. It's so helpful to actually take the solicitation and convert it into a template or an outline for yourself. We do whole webinars that are around just the proposal planning process. So we're just touching that at a very high level here. But just really taking your time to be prepared for the writing process. And then having a thoughtful plan around roles for the proposal development process and for the project. Of course, again, we have to show evidence of good planning as part of a competitive proposal. Having a well-developed budget, starting early with the budget, having a plan for executing the proposal development, thinking about deadlines with that plan. You'll have an external funder deadline, but you'll want to create sort of what I call interim or internal deadlines for yourselves as well. And having a process for who to turn to and who to get help from, especially if you encounter difficulties. So with that, we are coming to the end of our first webinar, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can pull up the second one.